to the same question. For, I think yourself and Ms Little went through some of the reasons why we expect the pay gap within the public service to be narrowing year on year. At what point in the future can we expect the 45% pension gap between men and women to finally disappear? Do you have a target date in mind for that?
I don't think the government has a target for that, but again, analytically, you would expect the pension pay gap to be eliminated some decades after, on average, the pay gap itself had been eliminated, since the pension gap is a consequence of the pay gap. So I don't think the government has a target for it, but regrettably, I think it can be expected to be some way into the future.
So given that the gender pay gap hasn't been eliminated for people who are coming into the public service just now, does that mean that some of these people will still face a gender pension gap when they finally retire in possibly 40, 45 years' time? Is that the kind of timescale we could be talking about before women get the same pension as men who've done the same work?
Well, of course, we have equal pay legislation, and I can't speak for every public authority, but I can certainly give you an assurance that in the Treasury, as an employer, we go to great lengths to ensure that we are both meeting our responsibilities there and closing the gender pay gap. And I think, I'm sure other employers are doing the same. The timescale over which it will happen, I can't say.
Thank you. I want to now look at the longer-term implications of people choosing to opt out of the employer schemes. First of all, Sir Tom, what information do you collect on employees who choose to opt out? For example, are you able to identify whether particular age groups, particular salary levels, or indeed particular racial or ethnic groups are more or less likely to opt out of the scheme? Is that information that you collect just now?
I'm not sure what level of detail we have on this, but perhaps Martin or Kat might have more information.
I can pick that up. So we don't, as standard, collect detailed opt-out rates within the Treasury, but the schemes do, and the schemes provide quite detailed assessment of opt-out rates where they've got the evidence as part of their information they provide to the public pay review bodies. And we obviously take a very close interest in that. The Treasury looks at...
Your close interest, do you see breakdowns of who's opting out?
So yes, we can access breakdowns where they're available. I should say that they're not always available. So, the Teachers' Pension Scheme has done an estimate of overall participation. There are lots of imperfections and issues with opt-out data, especially since auto-enrolment. So opt-out data in itself is not something we would look at in isolation. We do also look at wider membership data, so obviously numbers of members, contribution yields. We'll look at broader workforce data as a means of building up a picture about how participation is flowing, and wherever possible we will look at segregated and cohort data, but as I said, it's not widely available, but certainly at scheme level they have much more information than we do as standard.
Mr Grant. Mr
Grant. The NAO have found evidence to suggest that younger employees and employees generally on lower salary levels are more likely to opt out of the pension schemes. Is that something that the Treasury are aware of? Is it something that would give either the Treasury or the government more widely a cause for concern?
So anecdotally, yes, although, as I said in my previous response to Sir Geoffrey, the data is quite mixed, and I would refer back to this point about education, because, you know, and again, anecdotally, our hypothesis would be that younger people probably do not value the long-term pension benefits that accrue, which will feel very remote to them when compared to the immediate cash benefit of their salary. And so you can see why, if presented with the choice, it might be appealing. So it all comes back to education and making sure that when individual members make those choices, they've got the full facts and they understand the trade-off that they are making between short-term cash benefit versus longer-term pension benefit.
A number of young people just now will be looking at the news every day and seeing both public and private sector employers' pension schemes that are often unilaterally reducing the retirement benefits for their employees below the levels that employees thought they were signing up to when they entered the scheme. And we've clearly seen what's happened to the WASPy women in particular with the state pension scheme. A lot of women are now being told they won't get the pension they were promised when they originally signed up to it. Have you done any investigation as to whether those kinds of stories are damaging the trust that young people in particular put into their pension scheme? Is there an issue that they don't join the scheme because they just don't believe that the promises they're given just now will still be in place when they come to retire in 40 years' time?
Well, we haven't done any specific investigation, but of course public sector pension schemes by their nature are backed by government. They are defined contribution schemes, so you know, they're inherently different in risk to quite a lot of the private sector schemes that tend to cause the headlines. But it's not something that we've looked into specifically.
But you would accept that the state pension is a government-backed scheme, and that didn't help the WASPy women to get a fair deal from the changes that were made to their pensions?
Yes.
Okay, as a civil servant, you maybe can't comment on the fairness of it, but you would accept the fact that the state pension is a government-backed scheme did not prevent state pension rules from being changed to the detriment of a significant number, particularly of women born at particular times in the 50s.
Yes, I do agree with your point.
Mr. Grant.
Thank you. Do you have a concern that if people are opting out of their employer's scheme, they may become easier prey for other schemes that are less reliable, and that they may in fact be getting into the next Equitable Life, the next London Capital Finance, the next whatever the next of pension scandal is? Is that something the government or the Treasury take into account, that if you change the rules in such a way that it discourages people from signing up to the employer's scheme, it makes them more likely to fall victim to pension scams that they won't know about until the scheme collapses in 30 years' time?
Well, just generally on the subject of pension scams, obviously it's something that overall the government is very acutely aware of and has taken quite considerable action on over several years. So, for example, Project Bloom was established across government led by the pensions regulator to make sure that the lessons are learned and that we are actively doing everything that we can to prevent people taking on schemes where we're clear that there are scams involved. So that's part of wider government efforts. But once an employer or an employee withdraws or opts-outs from a public sector pension scheme, I don't think we actively trace what happens after the point at which they opt out, and we certainly don't collect data.
Mr. Grant.
Thank you. When you're assessing the changes or the impact of potential changes to a public sector scheme, what assessment do you make of any likely longer-term impact on other aspects of public spending, such as the benefit system?
Sorry, could you
just you're breaking up, you're a little bit unclear, Mr. Grant, in the room. If you could just repeat, please.
I beg your pardon. When you're assessing the impact of potential changes to public service pension schemes, what assessment do you make of the consequential impact elsewhere on public purse? For example, an increase in demand for benefits in the future?
So obviously pension costs are a very large part of public spending, and it's up to ministers to decide what proportion of public expenditure they want to focus on all parts of the public sector, including pensions, and that's certainly something that we consider as part of spending reviews, and at the point, in particular for pensions, at the point at which we've implemented reforms. So that was clearly part of the considerations that were undertaken back in 2011.
Thank you. You mentioned, going back to 2011, in 2011 this committee reported that if you make pension schemes more expensive to employees, more employees opt out, and subsequently more of those former employees have to rely on means-tested state benefits. The report went on to say that the important implications of this kind need to be evaluated and understood. What has the Treasury done in the 10 years since that report to make sure that you now do understand the implications for the benefit system, for example, of making changes to the pension schemes?
So firstly, if I refer back to my previous answer on participation and opt-out rates, at the moment opt-out rates are very, very low, certainly in proportion both to total participation but also to private sector schemes. We haven't specifically done any evaluation of the impact ultimately on individuals and whether they're more likely or less likely to need to access benefits. The other thing I'd say is ultimately we are still in the process of implementing the reforms from 2011 to 2015. So there will come a point where we need to undertake much more detailed evaluation, but our main focus at the moment is on implementing the major reforms as envisaged nearly 10 years ago.
But I think the point of the recommendation in the committee's report in 2011 was that before you decided on what changes you were going to make, before you decided on the changes that you're now implementing, you had to make sure that you understood the overall impact on the public finances. From what you're saying just now, it appears to me that you're implementing changes that were decided on before you had a full assessment of the impact on the number of people that would rely on benefits, for example, in the future. Is that correct?
It was back in the period of 2011 to 2015, we did undertake quite extensive evaluation of what we thought the forecast impact would be on a whole range of different circumstances. What I'm saying is that we haven't repeated that exercise as a post-implementation evaluation because we haven't finished the implementation. And I'm sorry if I misunderstood your question, Mr. Grant.
In 2012, the government produced an impact assessment for the Public Service Pensions Bill. Did that impact assessment include the likely impact on the number of people who had to rely on state benefits because the retirement, the employee pension wouldn't be enough?
I don't know directly off the top of my head. I apologise. I don't know if Mr. Clark knows.
I'm sorry, I'm not aware of that, whether that was included or not.
Okay, is that something, though, that the Government's Actuaries Department could do an analysis of to work out if a pension's lower, people can't afford their rent, for example, they claim housing benefit and all those knock-on effects? Is that something you could model?
It's possible. I think there's lots of variables in that, but with a fair amount of thought, it's perhaps something we could put our minds to if that's what our government clients want us to do.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Grant.
Thank you. Yeah, just one final question, Chair, if I may, to round off this section, and it's probably for the Permanent Secretary to answer. What we've been saying, Sir Tom, is that if we make the wrong changes to a public sector pension scheme just now, the consequence in the future can be that effectively more public servants retire into poverty. They retire on a pension that's not enough to get by on and have to rely on state-funded benefits, income-related benefits. Is that in itself something that the government considers to be an undesirable consequence of changes to the schemes?
If I can go back to my first answer, the policy objective of the reforms 10 years ago, set out at the time, was certainly to put the public sector pension system on a sustainable basis, affordability, but it was also within that to ensure decent income from retirement and an attractive overall package of remuneration for public sector to attract and retain public sector workers. So it's already inherent in the design of the reforms and the objective of the policy.
But if, as has been indicated in the NAO report, younger employees and low-paid employees in particular don't think the pension scheme is for them, doesn't that suggest that in that key objective the reforms haven't worked?
Well, as Kat has said, we're in the very early stages of the reforms. These things play out over several decades. The indication is that opt-out rates are quite low.
When you say the indication, Sir Tom, I mean, when the National Audit Office asked questions of your officials about this, and there was no data available to the Treasury to provide to the National Audit Office.
Kat's got some information.
So if we go down to the main schemes, I mean, the TPS is 92 to 93% participation, so obviously the converse being the opt-out rate. Civil service is less than 1% opt-out. The NHS is around 90% active membership. I don't have the armed forces data off the top of my head, but again...
But you have that data. You do have that data.
Oh, absolutely. And we can
we make sure that it's supplied to the National Audit Office?
So I think in our conversations with the National Audit Office, we entirely agree with their sentiment that we've got to pay very close attention to opt-out rates. The Treasury doesn't directly itself collect that data, but we monitor it. And that's the distinction that I would make. And certainly the schemes are collecting and analysing and sharing that information where possible, but most notably through the pay review body process, which takes into account overall remuneration.
Okay. Sorry, I cut you partway through your answer, Sir Tom, so if you want to continue in your response.
I think I've mostly finished it.
Thank you.
And but clearly any future changes that are considered would have to take into account the kind of effect that Mr. Grant that you're referring to.
Absolutely. Mr. Grant?
Just finally, Chair, as well as the percentage figures that are quoted there, it would be helpful if we could get information about the actual number of people who are opting out, because what can look like a small percentage of the total number of teachers in England and Wales, for example, could translate into a lot of individual people who may not be adequately provided for in their retirement. So it'd be quite interesting if we could see the numbers of people as well as the percentages. But there's no more questions from me just now, Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Grant, I'm now turning to Sean Bailey MP. Over to you, Mr. Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I want to drill down a bit more into the Armed Forces offering. Ms. Little, could you confirm how we can ensure that the offering to people wanting to join the Armed Forces in terms of a pension ensures that we're still able to recruit and retain the best?
And obviously I would think of the pensions offer as part of total remuneration, and of course that's something that the Armed Forces Pay Review Body considers on behalf independently and then provides the recommendation to government. So that's just to reiterate the process. I would say the Armed Forces pension scheme is very generous. I think from memory it's got a 42% employer contribution rate, one of the highest of the four main schemes. One of the challenges that we always, certainly during my time at the MAD, we were working on was making sure that everybody really understood the benefit of that 42% contribution. And certainly at the time I left the MOD, we were looking at how we could actually denote on individual members of the Armed Forces pay slips a bit more specifically the information about what that kind of line that says employee and employer contribution, to actually spell it out in plain English, so that as they received their pay slip there was a really clear explanation of the value of that line. But it's an ongoing challenge, and as I said earlier, we've got to completely commit to doing as much as we can to educate and communicate the value of pensions overall.
Okay. Thank you for that, Ms. Little. I'm very conscious that with the Armed Forces pension in particular, it's been a very unique place because quite often it is relied upon by people who are effectively trying to set themselves up in a second civilian life after they've served. So I'm just conscious, working with obviously the Armed Forces pay body, how is Treasury trying to ensure that in this particular instance, members of the Armed Forces that have done their 22 years can rely on that in order to set up their civilian life? Because this has certainly been something I've heard from Armed Forces organisations that they're very concerned about.
Generally there are differences for uniformed public service workers across the board, because we do recognise that the physical requirements of the role, for firefighters, for members of the armed forces, are very, very different. So I would of course say that it's not just the armed forces where we're very conscious of the need to make sure that pensions are fit for purpose and reflect the overall requirements of their employers. But ultimately, as I said at the start, Mr. Bailey, the process for making sure that we're providing the right overall remuneration and to ensure that we're monitoring it is through the pay review body process, which is undertaken annually.
Mr. Bailey.
I absolutely understand that, Chair. I mean, my point was, I get that the pay review body process, I completely understand that's slightly a job, but you do have a feeding into that. And my point was, are you confident that, say, someone that's joined the army or the armed forces at 18, leaves at 40, is going to have enough of a basis there to set up a new civilian life? Because this is the pushback that I've certainly received from armed forces organisations, that they're concerned that might not be the case. So just to ask again, are you confident that someone could set up a second life on the basis of that offering?
So it's quite a subjective judgment, isn't it? And it will depend on individuals. But what I can say is that the main schemes are significantly more generous than equivalent private sector schemes, and the Armed Forces scheme has the highest level of employer contribution rate. So, of course, it's designed with some of the circumstances that you mentioned in mind, but it is by no doubt, it will be much more generous than any other scheme that an individual could access within the public sector or the private sector.
Okay, so I mean, surely there's a counter argument there that when a member of uniformed personnel is putting their life on the line, that perhaps that is I see what you're saying around the generosity point, but surely is there not a counterbalance there with the fact that person's putting their life on the line? I mean, we've had this pushback from armed forces charities as well around this point about employer contributions. I'd just be keen to understand again how you're balancing those risks in terms of as I say, particularly the dangerous nature of the roles with the offer that's there. Is that part of the rationale behind the increased employer contributions?
So your point of, obviously the armed forces play a unique role in protecting society in this country, and that is reflected in the total remuneration that the armed forces receive. I don't think it's really for me to judge whether I'm confident that will in all circumstances be the right level, if I'm frank, Mr. Bailey, but that is what the pay review body is designed to reflect in its consideration of how adequate total remuneration is for the armed forces as a whole.
Okay, but you must, I mean, just to take a step back a minute, I mean, there must be some form of analysis or data that you've done to, across the board to ensure that, as I say, that offering there is adequate in terms of the risks that people are putting themselves through and the potential knock-on as a result of those risks. And as we've just discussed previously, the base level required for an individual at, say, 40, who's got to restart again to be able to do that. I mean, surely, in conjunction with the pay review body, there must be some sort of analysis that's been done on this.
I'm not aware specifically off the top of my head, but I'm very happy to take that way and come back to you.
Be grateful for that. Finally, Chair, just one final question from me. Given the sort of the changing nature and the evolving risks for personnel, do you think that the current annual information that personnel receive is enough do you think perhaps that needs to be more frequent in order that more informed choices can be made around pension offerings and pension choices?
Is that for all schemes, Mr. Bailey, or for the armed forces in particular?
Specifically for the armed forces, but you can expand that out to other schemes as well.
Yes, so I know that the Armed Forces pension scheme provide a range of different communications to help their members understand the value of pensions. It's not just the annual membership statement that they get. There are frequent online communications, newsletters and other forms of engagement so that people understand exactly how their benefits and pension rights affect them. So I'm confident that the Armed Forces pension scheme takes this very seriously.
Okay, I'll leave that there, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bailey. We've talked a little. We've touched on other sectors, and we know other sectors outside of the public sector are changing the way they do schemes because of this affordability issue, particularly for the employer. Is it really sensible, do you think, Ms. Little, for the government to keep swimming against that tide? Is it swimming against a tide of change that's where other sectors are recognising there's a big challenge about how to fund pensions in this way?
Well, the 2011 reforms were put in place precisely because of this rising issue of affordability. And so, obviously in the private sector, it's more acute, especially where you've got funded.
Well, but that's, we know that history. But the point is that now employer contributions have gone up incredibly. So up to 25%. Well, the armed forces is slightly different because for all the reasons of the pay review that takes place there. But if public sector services are paying out that much money for their employees, that's affecting the services that they can deliver. That is very costly to them. So, basically, can the nation continue to afford public sector pension schemes the way that they're funded, even under the reforms?
So, obviously, overall, our view is that we wanted to make sure that affordability is sustained over a long period of time. And as Sir Tom said, that ultimate measure is over a 50-year period. So our view at the moment is
that... But employer contributions are now. That's the bit that's
I suppose... apologies, Chair. So I suppose that the cost control mechanism was one of the recommendations from the 2011 report, and it was partly to make sure that over time there was a symmetrical way of making sure that member costs and employer costs were more fairly balanced. And of course, we might come on to this, but that was one of the mechanisms that allowed us to be able to say, look, depending on whether there's a flaw or a breach, we'll be able to adjust and ensure that there's a fair proportion of costs between employers and members.
Well, I'm going to come to Mr. Clark, particularly on the cost control mechanism in a moment, but we've seen now, we've talked about private schools coming out, and the DfE's been looking into that. We've got the British Medical Association's put in evidence to us actually some months ago, but particularly for this inquiry as well, about the impact on consultants, something that was raised in this committee in 2012 with the then Permanent Secretary at Health about senior doctors coming out, so it's not been something that's been unknown. Higher education, they've written to us, of course, because they've inherited public sector pension schemes, but a lot they are now private bodies. So we've got a lot of challenges, and if these individuals or these groups push to pull out or be treated differently, how sustainable is it to maintain even the changes that were made in 2011-12?
So just on the schemes that you've mentioned there, Chair, as you say, the USS is has nothing to do with government because its members' employers are private bodies. Ultimately, I think the thrust of your question is probably getting at overall kind of responsibility for some of the pension risks that we're seeing more broadly. Obviously, we want to make sure that we understand and monitor how other public sector bodies are dealing and managing and reforming their schemes, but fundamentally that is for them as non-government bodies and independent employers to manage, not for central government itself.
Okay, but we're stacking up a big challenge for the future, and as our colleagues have touched on, you've got opt-out rates, potential. We don't know what will happen in the future as it's more expensive. You've got a whole generation that's not a property-only generation because that's not affordable for a lot of them, people with interest-only mortgages, and then potentially lower or not opting into the pension scheme. So I asked Mr. Clark earlier about whether they can do any actuarial and evaluation of the potential impact of that sort of activity, if you like, on future costs to the Exchequer. Is that something that's in your mind? And have you done, or are you planning to do any work to look at what will happen if people don't sign up to their pensions in the wider context of their economic situation compared to, say, what my kids would call the boomers?
Yeah. So we haven't currently got any active evaluation being undertaken, but it's certainly in our mind. And as I said earlier, once we've got through the immediate implementation of the 2011 reforms, we obviously want to make sure that we have continuing monitoring and evaluation. So it's certainly something that we will come to.
Mr. Tom.
Add one thing to that. So as Kat said earlier, we do in conversation with Mr. Grant, we do monitor the opt-out data, and if that starts to show a trend, and it might be a trend just at the younger end of the workforce, which might not seem to pick up what Mr. Grant was saying earlier about percentages. It might not be a big percentage, but it might be concentrated, for example, in the younger end or the least well-paid end of the workforce. That is one of the things that we would hope to pick up. And if we see that beginning to develop, then that clearly then raises the question that you've put.
Okay, and in terms of we've touched earlier on whether the breakdown of other groups that might not be taking up their pensions, perhaps because they're in low-paid jobs, and maybe that might be more concentrated in certain groups of people, certain ethnicities, for example. Is that something that's in your mind to evaluate the equality impact of this? Because you could end up, if you had, say, a group of people who were opting out because of the immediate affordability issue as they saw it, that could stack up problems and cause them longer-term problems in their retirement. Is that something that is at all in the Treasury's sights?
I'm hesitant because I'm not sure about the detailed breakdown of the information that we have. So clearly, in order to
should you not be curious about it, even if you haven't got the detailed breakdown? We've heard that the schemes have information. I don't know if they even break it down like that. But whether they do or not, do you think that would not be a sensible approach? Because we could see a really big inequality stacking up that we don't even realise about at this moment. And all it takes is the right data to develop it. And I'm sure Mr. Clark will have some views, but Sir Tom.
We should look at that.
So Tom, what about from the actuarial point of view? Is there anything you can do with the data that's available that would be able to shine a light on some of these potential challenges for certain groups?
In terms of data, not specifically from data I've seen, what would have to happen would be that the various workforces equality data in terms of ethnicity, for example, would have to be matched to their pension data to fuse those together. I'm not aware at this moment whether any of those schemes have actually done that. It is subject to sort of all the data restrictions. It is theoretically possible to do that and to form some sort of emerging view. It will depend, of course, on the quality of the breakdown of workforce composition data as to whether that, the validity of some of that, because obviously there are issues elsewhere about people reporting their ethnicity, for example. But it's theoretically possible, depends on the quality of the data and the willingness to share it across various sectors, from sort of workforce data into pensions data. But it is theoretically possible.
Well, obviously, it's anyway straightforward male-female because of the volume of people, because half of the population is female, so that throws it up. We can. It sounds like there's work to be done there, but then potentially. Can I just check, so Tom, just for the record, that the Treasury's position or the government's position is still that there should be no more major changes to pension systems for the next 25 years?
I'm not sure if the phrase is the next 25 years, but
that's what we've had that a lot in evidence. People wanting that guarantee or that confirmation. So what's your time frame then for changes? For how long you would want to stick with what we've got at the moment? I'm going to touch on McLeod, which might throw
do we have a formal? Is there a formal government policy on that? I'm not sure that there is.
No, ultimately. The priority at the moment is to implement the last set of reforms, and
then how long is the steady as she goes period after that?
Exactly. Ultimately, We need to make sure that we implement them, we evaluate them, but there are no intentions for any cross-government reform, but it's something we continue to monitor.
Yeah, okay, well, so that brings me on to McLeod. So the changes came in, we had the Hutton review, cross-party consensus that things need to be done, we've got auto-enrolment on the private sector, lots of exciting potential things happening to get people to save for their future. And then, of course, the McLeod remedy came along. How did we get into this mess, Sir Tom?
Well, that's all well.
I mean, you don't need to go through the court case, but
well-trodden ground. I think. Well, the court case looked at the policy that had been introduced. The policy itself had been introduced following quite widespread consultation, including with employers and trade unions, and there was a strong feeling expressed in the consultation that there was a need for protection for people closer to retirement date, which was why that was incorporated into the system, and that was upheld by judgments in some courts, but ultimately overturned by the Court of Appeal. So it was a policy that came out of a long consultation process.
But you did have legal advice at the point that you implemented the changes that there could be a challenge under the Equality Act.
I don't know what legal advice we had at the time, but I'm sure that the legal advice would have looked at the possibility for challenge. It always does. Yeah.
Okay. But I just wonder what the probability of that challenge was when the decision was made.
I don't know.
Okay, but if you can dig that out and write us, that would be very helpful. And it is a very complex issue, McLeod, because it's the restitution means that many schemes will be operating two parallel systems: the old scheme and the new scheme, and it will be at the point of retirement that people can have the choice in many schemes. It depends on the scheme, of course. So, but they could decide at retirement, which means that that's pension schemes will be having to run two parallel schemes. And that's quite costly, and potentially is the Treasury looking into supporting employers and schemes on that? Cat Little, you nodded.
Yes. So, as you alluded to, in February we announced the remedy and the deferred choice underpin. So it's only really in the last couple of months that schemes have been able to start to assess the estimated costs. So we are working very closely with schemes, and I would expect as soon as we've got that information available, then it will obviously be factored into the spending review and into departmental budget considerations.
So there's no in principle decision by the Treasury at this point to fund the cost of that part of dealing with the outflow?
No, we're asking schemes to tell us what they think the estimated costs are.
Okay, and so far it seems to be that there's the general thrust of government, if we're reading it right, is that this cost should be shared between the Exchequer and, well, in the other bits of the pension system where the pension contributions went up, the Exchequer gave some money, but not enough, so employers had to cover some of that. Is that the general principle, general rule of thumb for what you're thinking about with McLeod as well?
We haven't yet developed any sort of principles. I think we're just waiting for schemes to
tell us. So the
one
does not necessarily mean that that's the necessary thinking for...
Yes, it's not necessarily the precedent that we would apply for funding.
Well, that's maybe a crumb of comfort for some other pension funds. But overall, who's going to pay for the £17 billion mistake that McLeod has thrown up, Sir Tom?
Well, it's public sector pension, so ultimately it's the public sector.
Yeah, but I mean, will the Treasury support schemes?
I don't think this has been...
So, ultimately, this is where it gets a bit complicated, the impact of the McLeod remedy will be included in the 2016 valuation, and ultimately will be borne by member costs going up. We've then got to apply the cost control mechanism to the 2016 valuation, and the reason why we announced that we would in effect waive ceilings where target costs are exceeded is because we do not want members to be put in a worse position than they would have been prior to the McLeod remedy being implemented. So ultimately, the costs will be borne by members, but the cost control mechanism will manage that cost. So the ultimate logic from that is, well, who pays for the cost of the waiver? And that will need to be considered as part of the valuation process which then sets the employment contribution rate.
I mean, this all goes back into when there'll be other changes. It's going to take so long to deal with McLeod and the outfall of that it would, I think, be helpful if as soon as the Treasury has a position, I suppose it's a policy decision about how long there will be a guarantee on no more changes, and whether is it possible, do you think, to make that guarantee about no further changes, given that we're already seeing, for example, we keep mentioning the private schools possibly opting out of the teachers' pension. If you saw more of that, that could make some of these pensions far less sustainable in the long term, and there's nothing to stop those groups leaving.
So I mean, that's obviously for ministers, and as I said, we really just need to make sure we implement these reforms and make sure we understand the impact of them.
I mean, it seems to me that we need to see this in the round, as I was saying, about the wider impact, and I'm concerned about that seeming lack of evaluation about trends in different generations. So those who are already well into a pension scheme are in one group, those who have obviously retired are in another, but it is those young people coming through with a very different economic outlook. So anyone who bought a house in the 1970s would have been able to, one, buy it, and two, it would have gone up as an appreciable asset, which is then part of a retirement pot, in effect, even if it wasn't intended for that purpose. That is not going to be the case for most of my constituents, of whom about a third of my constituents are under the age of 35, or 20, actually even younger than that, under 34 or something. So they're not homeowners, they won't have that cushion. This is going to be a huge economic impact for the nation if those people are going to need support for their housing, to living costs, and they've only got a small, they maybe opted out of their public sector pension and they've got their state pension alone to live on. Is this something that anybody is looking at or thinking about in your purview?
So as Sir Tom said, I mean, it's clearly something we need to look at. And as you alluded to, if we do further evaluation, then obviously we've got time to be able to consider it and work that through into future policy development. But as Sir Tom said, we'll take that away.
I hope you will, because it's not something that ministers, this is what you call slow politics pensions, and most ministers are not in a job long enough to see the impact, as Mr Osborne should live and remember, of his decisions on this issue. But I mean, it is, I hope, down to a long-standing civil service to make sure that these pins are put on ministers' seats so that people think about it. I'll just make that plea. Mr Clark, I wanted to talk to you about the cost control mechanism, because I believe there were issues about introducing it, and that the Government Actuary Department did raise some concerns. Could you just perhaps for the sake of people maybe watching this, give a very simple explanation of what the cost control mechanism is, and then tell us how you think it's been working.
This is a product of the reforms, and the cost control mechanism is a way of baselining costs within these schemes and measuring at future valuations whether the costs have moved sufficiently far from that baseline to justify some correction to the benefits. And what was put in place was a mechanism which had what was a margin around that baseline of 2 percentage points of the payroll, and where at subsequent valuations the measured costs had moved outside that corridor, then the mechanism was intended to force the scheme managers to apply some remedy, which would be either to reduce the benefits or increase them, depending on which way it went, or corresponding with the contributions. That was introduced as part of reforms. So the valuations that were being done in 2016 were the first full iteration of that evaluation. And the purpose of the cost cap mechanism, or the government's objectives, are to maintain or to control costs from the taxpayer's point of view, to maintain value from the member's point of view, and to achieve stability, and to only make those changes I referred to in terms of benefits due to unexpected or unforeseen events. So in 2016, the emerging news from the valuation, based on provisional results, was that for a couple of reasons, the schemes had all breached that corridor by virtue of the fact that the costs were more than 2% lower than that baseline. And this was obviously the first time of asking, as it were. and coincided with the McLeod issue we've just been speaking about. So the government didn't run through the full process, and those valuations were paused whilst the remedy was the McLeod issue had begun to be tended to, and also announced that I would be commissioned to review that whole process of the cost cap mechanism, which is a